Hi, and welcome to the Restorative Wellness Clinicians Corner, a video series exclusively for functional health professionals, where we interview the top experts in the latest research, products, tools, and best practices for getting your clients exceptional results. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the RWS Clinicians Corner. I'm super excited for our talk tonight. We have Dr. Mason Bresett with us, all the way from Canada, just outside of Toronto in Sarnia. Dr. Mason Bresett is a naturopathic doctor with a strong background in mycology. He has experience using mushrooms in a clinical health and wellness setting. He has a general family naturopathic practice in Sarnia, Ontario, Canada, the Health Creation Lab, great branding. He uses medicinal mushrooms daily to support his patients, and that's what we're going to do a deep dive into today, the use of mushrooms, functional mushrooms in a clinical practice. And he continues to provide a balance of historical and up-to-date medicinal mushroom research for the health and wellness professionals. He's also actively engaged in multiple projects with universities, medical doctors, and functional oncologists, setting up research studies using medicinal mushroom extracts. Dr. Bresett is the Chief Science Advisor at Real Mushrooms, which is one of our absolute favorite functional mushroom supplement companies. So welcome, Mason. We loved having you here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me. Okay, so we're going to talk about mushrooms today. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see some smiley faces in the room, in the Zoom room. So we're going to get right into this. And yeah, bring all your questions, type them in the chat so we can kind of compile them, and we'll go through those all at the end. We're going to talk about mushrooms and how to, work with them in a nutrition or a wellness setting and how to apply them to your clients. So this is me. As Margaret said, I'm a naturopathic doctor. My clinic's here in the Great Lake region, close to Toronto. Still a bit of a drive, but it's in that zone. And I spent the majority of my education years on the west coast of Canada. So just a few conflict of interest for my presentation. I am the Chief Science Advisor for the mushroom company that Margaret mentioned, Real Mushrooms. And today, what we're going to go into is different ways to apply mushroom extracts and mushrooms in the diet. So this is just a little bit of my bio. I've been researching mushrooms for almost the past decade, doing a lot of research now with them, and also a lot of education and consulting around the whole field of mycology. Been doing some talks like this and some other bigger ones. And yeah, I use mushrooms almost, daily in my practice. So I've got a pretty good handle on, the ins and outs of, what to use them for, what has worked, what hasn't. And really working with other practitioners through the Real Mushrooms practitioner team, I've been able to learn a lot from them too on how other clinicians are using mushrooms and the success that they're getting. So we're going to talk about a little bit of quality and the fungal anatomy picture before we get into the clinical stuff, because I think it's really important. We're going to talk about how mushrooms are grown and why that will be important for you in your practice. And then we're going to go into the constituents and compounds in mushrooms, some clinical applications. We're going to go through most of the mushrooms that I work with mostly and that, are commonly available to you in your practice. And then we'll do a wrap up with some Q&A. So here you can see an image, and this one's not the greatest one because I couldn't zoom it out without it getting blurry, but you can see here, this is the 3 different fungal parts. So on the right, you have the below ground mycelium, and then you've got the mushroom as it kind of sort of goes clockwise, and then you've got the spore. So those are the 3 fungal parts traditionally known in the mycology world. And why this is important is because you'll see different products out there made from the different parts and different growing strategies to work with these different parts. So at Real Mushrooms, we only use the mushroom, and I'm going to go into that right now. And there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to translating all the research here. So this is why it becomes really important. So here's another picture. You can just see that above ground part of the fungus, that's known as the mushroom or the fruiting body. And then you've got the below ground part, which is the mycelium. And then, I'm sure you guys have seen a couple documentaries on mushrooms now and are experts in this kind of whole this area with like the underground tree networks and all that. The spores aren't present on this picture, but that's that reproductive part of the fungus. So here you can see some mushrooms growing outside in a greenhouse. So these are the actual above ground mushrooms. And this is a really important way to cultivate mushrooms, because mushrooms, as you see in nature, are grown on wood. And when we grow mushrooms on wood and you're using mushrooms supplements that are grown on wood in your practice, you're going to get a lot of the primary active compounds in the mushrooms and the medicine. Here's another picture of a reishi. So each one of these reishis is actually buried on a log, and it comes out above ground, and that's when it's harvested after many days of many days of life. And they're usually harvested right before they kind of go into the spore phase, because that's when they're the most active. This is an example of another product that's called myceliated grain, or mycelium on grain. And what they do is they kind of grow those spores and they let them inoculate on some sort of grain substrate. And then they grow that for a few days, a few weeks, and then they cultivate that whole combination of the product. And what ends up happening is that grain that it's grown on always ends up in the final product. So you're going to get less of the actual, well, there's no mushroom, and you're just getting something called myceliated grain. So you'll see these products on the market, and they usually have lower bioactive compounds. And there's a few other ways to grow mushrooms. This one is the liquid spawn, or the liquid fermentated mycelium. And this one's a little bit different. You can see Sky and Jeff there standing beside or a couple of these big tanks, and you can actually grow mushrooms in a liquid medium, grow mycelium in a liquid medium, and you get an actual 100% pure mycelium. That is different from the myceliated grain products out there in the market. So just to go into this not too much further, but to study these things, we basically know that the bulk of the starch that remains in the myceliated grain products has far more value of the alpha, or the starch, in them. And the mushrooms have significantly more beta-D-glucans, which are that main bioactive immune modulating component that I'm sure you've heard of. So this chart on the right here did a big study on different mushroom or myceliated grain products. And you can see that the ones at the top here with the high beta-glucan percentage, like that reishi at the top, it's 45% or 45% beta-glucan, compared to some of these other ones that were almost 7.3% beta-glucan. So you can see that in the analytical framework, it's really important to know where your medicine's coming from, because that's where the immune and the gut and all the other clinical applications that we're going to talk about come from. Oh yeah, this is the title. So you can see there that the high beta-glucan percentage at the top there, those are mushrooms at the top, and then the mycelium is lower down here, where you're seeing a really high starch percentage, the 53% starch, the 83% starch, the 64% starch. So really important to know just what you're giving your clients as medicine. And this, I love this like visual here, but you can see here that the sort of red and green lines, that's basically myceliated grain mapped out with the actual grain nutritional value that they're grown on. And you can see that there's not really a distinct nutritional profile there. So the product is actually just matching whatever it's grown on. And in that case, it's just the grain that the majority of the product is coming through as. Where you can see the blue line is a very distinct nutritional profile, which is the cordyceps, in this case, grown on, or it's the cordyceps mushroom, not the myceliated grain. So really important to take into consideration when just choosing medicine, choosing mycology as medicine and functional mushrooms. So this is just a checklist, and you can have this in your notes to just kind of go through and make sure that that's something you're getting within your products. And this is all timely because our company has actually, our parent company, Namex, just submitted a petition filed to the FDA to do better labeling laws within the mycology world. So it's basically everything I just talked about to an extent. So here's the active compounds in mushrooms that are going to help them work clinically for you with your patients and your clients. So the big ones I've bolded, and some of these kind of have some relative discussions that we'll have, but the big ones that you've heard of are the beta-D-glucans and also the triterpenes. But mushrooms have an amazing array of different compounds. And some of them I've listed here, like mannans, ergosterol, ergothioneine, these different proteins and peptides. These are all really, really important when looking at some of these like secondary characteristics. But the primary characteristics we're always looking at are those beta-D-glucans. And some mushrooms like chaga, like reishi, they're very, or they're higher in triterpenes compared to some of the other mushrooms. So we will talk about that a little bit today. So here's just an image of a beta-D-glucan, and they're these specific branches and chains is why they get their name. And we know that different yeast also have beta-D-glucans, like oats and different foods as well, on top of yeast. So the mushroom beta-D-glucans, they're just a little bit different, or a lot, in the sense that they have a more complex and kind of 3D structure, which gives them more immunogenic potential or immune modulation capacities. So here's a nice list of just a non-exhaustive list of studies that I compiled. And you can see here that there's a lot of these nutrition or observation or epidemiological studies. They're not perfect, but there's something to work with. And there's a lot in the mushroom world, specifically in the cognitive decline world. There's a couple studies on oncology and cancer-related illness, and also looking at metabolic health. You can see there's an obesity one, and also looking at these new studies looking at even mood. So these are just a little bit of a snapshot into the available evidence right now. And I just wanted to give you like a brief kind of look at just like some of the ideas and some of the areas that some of these studies are on. And so, immune system, cancer, cognitive decline, and also some of these other metabolic ones. So that's a little bit small. Sorry about that. I thought that was a bit bigger. But basically, to summarize that last slide, is that eating more mushrooms can have a very positive impact on your health for these different areas that I mentioned. And one of them is just all-cause mortality, is what one of these studies suggested. And they just said if you ate one non-meat, red meat meal and replace that with shrooms or mushrooms, you'd have basically a reduction in the all-cause mortality. So just meaning like the amount of time it takes you to die. So less of that, which is always good for everybody. And there's a few cancer studies in this epidemiology like studies and observation and cohort studies. Most of them are in the breast and prostate world, but overall cancer risks were also, this isn't a cause or a correlation, but there's trends and associations here with a dose-dependent reduction when eating more mushrooms. And one of the studies used 18 grams of mushrooms per day. So not a huge amount, but, a decent amount to be eating mushrooms, that amount of mushrooms every day. So breast and prostate seem to have more of the preventative literature on them, and then cognitive decline. So there's a few studies looking at the more mushrooms you eat, there's an association with having less cognitive decline. And the amount there was 30 grams 3 times a week. So again, a very doable amount, but still, having to get mushrooms into you or your clients' lives on a consistent basis. There's a little bit of data on mental health with some depression trends. So just a trend looking at, the more mushroom consumption you have and the more mushroom consumption your clients have, possibly there's a trend there towards less depression. And then there's a lot of studies in the metabolic syndrome and metabolic functioning world. A little bit of study on preeclampsia, which is something we don't actually have a lot of good either medicine or natural therapeutics for. So that dose was very high, but it's just an option if you have any fertility or any patients that have that condition. Mushrooms are something that they could just incorporate into their diet to help that condition out. So looking at all this nutritional observational research, we can basically try, and I'd like you to try to get your clients, the ones that don't mind the texture, to eat more mushrooms. And there's ways to do that. Diet is best. There are extracts, available in capsule and powder format, which I'll talk to you about. But diet is going to be huge here, as we know that lifestyle is that number one thing that is required to move the needle in a lot of cases and to help a lot of people with their health outcomes. So this is just a brief summary slide of some of those studies that I had pulled out to show you. So the big clinical applications we'll get into now, and we're going to kind of go broad to more specific here, and looking at how you can, take the information away today in a very practical way and kind of put it in categories. So the first category would be, looking at mushrooms as sort of like a digestive aid and a microbiome supporting agent. So we have studies that suggest that the fibers in mushrooms and eating mushrooms in the diet or in extract form can increase different gut metabolites like short chain fatty acids. They are a nice prebiotic because of their insoluble fiber and some soluble fiber when eating them in the diet. And they have these different connections based on their affinity to sort of have their mechanism of action working at that gut level. So, there's the gut-brain connection, there's the gut-immune connection. And we know that our immune system is basically the majority of what goes on in our gut. So, and there's a gut-skin connection. So I think that mushrooms can really support creating a robust digestive system, whether that's a patient that has a little bit of dysbiosis, whether that's a patient that, maybe has infrequent or constipation problems, maybe they have, an IBS picture. I do believe that mushrooms can have an impact here. And I think the big role they're playing is helping with our diversity. So really, like fruits and veggies, I try to get all my patients to eat, try to get more diversity in the diet, not just eating the same things. And the same thing for mushrooms, which is amazing because there's so many mushrooms that we can kind of even diversify our mushroom intake. So from a preventative and also a treatment perspective, I think that mushrooms should be considered for your treatment plans with your digestive patients, and also looking at how that digestive system impacts some of the other systems which your patients may be coming in for. Maybe that's a sort of like an endocrine problem, or maybe that's an immune deficiency. Looking at the gut is always a good place to start. And as mentioned in some of those studies, the metabolic system is a great area where mushrooms can really help your clients. And part of that is just because of their macronutrient profile to begin with. And then we get into more of their medicinal or functional compounds that can help with health. So they're majority carbohydrates. So with the fibers that we mentioned on the previous slide, they're a not bad protein source for a non-meat food source. So some mushrooms have almost up to 20-30% protein, which is pretty remarkable for folks to work with if they are trying to hit protein goals, and maybe they're backing off the meat a little bit, or they have an all plant diet. Mushrooms are great for that reason, and they're not a significant source of fats, but there are a few fats in mushrooms. So looking at how they support the metabolic system, we'll get into more detailed in some of the single mushrooms, but basically the impact, I think, has, again, something to do with their microbiome modulation. They have a lot of rich fibers in them, and they're really unique in the sense that they actually have quite a good amount of minerals, vitamins, and nutrients in them. So we'll talk about some of those in terms of the individual mushrooms, but for an example, selenium, like mushrooms are a great source of selenium. And if you're like me, you prescribed, Brazil nuts for many, many years, and, people get sick of that. So selenium, very high in some mushrooms compared to other foods. Zinc, they've got all the basic minerals as well. And they're actually a decent source of some B vitamins, especially shiitake and oyster. Those mushrooms are particularly high in B vitamins. And those B vitamins can kind of add some like methylation support to your patients' plans as well, if you guys are working with any of that and trying to help just basically increase the epigenetics there or support the epigenetics. And I wouldn't use mushrooms alone for blood sugar regulation, but I think they have a part to play there. So I hope that that's kind of clear. And using them in a combined lifestyle treatment plan would be my preferred approach. So the big topic with mushrooms is their immune modulation properties. So I've kind of broken this down here to a couple different areas. One would be acute immune conditions. So that's like your common colds, flus, influenzas, viruses, upper and lower respiratory tract infections. The second would be, chronic immune problems. So these are things maybe like co-infections, chronic viral infections, things that, are there longer than 6 months to a year. And then also just immune modulation for these more chronic immune disorders. So this is when we're getting into more of the oncology conversation and how to use mushrooms, working with patients in that world. So these are some of my favorite studies, and you're happy to screenshot these, or I can send you the list here. But this is just a few great studies in the oncology world showing how mushrooms can be an adjunct therapy with conventional treatments. So this is mostly done using reishi and Coriolis, so reishi and turkey tail, and they actually use very specific forms of these mushrooms. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different forms and how to, deduce that evidence and come up with plans to implement that with your clients. But essentially, mushrooms can be really helpful with cancer patients, and they're always best used in an adjunct setting. So all these studies show them while using them in conjunction with conventional treatment, looking at mostly things like improved clinical parameters, quality of life, immune tests. So looking at things like natural killer cells, different immune subsets, and looking at sometimes, survival rate. And yeah, sometimes there can be, a little bit of help. There's different cancers that more of this data is on. So we will talk about those when we get to the individual mushrooms on how to do that. Another area which I think mushrooms can be supportive in your client's treatment plans from a practical perspective is anyone going through the list here. So the most studies with lion's mane have been done using the mushroom. So there's about 4 or 5 good clinical studies now using just the lion's mane mushroom. And there's a lot of good preclinical or animal studies using the mycelium for lion's mane, but there's a few also new studies showing that you can use an isolated compound from the mycelium as well. But the majority of the studies are done on fruiting bodies or mushrooms. And you can basically impact things like, memory and executive functioning is what some of the studies show. And the big mushrooms they've been studying are obviously lion's mane. I'm sure you've heard of that one as like the brain mushroom or the neurocentric mushroom. And I also would like to bring to your attention tremella. There's actually a clinical study on tremella, a specific isolated polysaccharide, meaning it's sort of like a fraction of that mushroom. So those are the 2 mushrooms to look at when dosing for this particular reason. And I put a rough consideration for a dose. Obviously take that into context with the patient, and everything else I'm mentioning here is just for, information, just to give you guys a good look at what the data says and also how to apply that. But again, make sure you're working with, their healthcare professional, their health history and all that to make the best choices. So looking at, cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases, this is where we can use mushrooms, I believe, to help impact these cases. And the neurodegenerative diseases, you could use the 2 mushrooms I mentioned. And there's another compound actually being studied right now in a clinical trial in Singapore for dementia, and they're using 25 milligrams of ergothioneine. And ergothioneine was on the active compound slide that I showed you at the start, but that's sort of like this sulfur-containing adaptive antioxidant, and it's really good for any kind of oxidative stress. And we know with some of these long-term neurodegenerative diseases or conditions, there is oxidative stress around. So that is something new on the horizon, and there's studies in the works right now. COVID kind of slowed some of that down, but we're eagerly waiting to see how that goes. So the best way to dose this would be, you could try to eat them and get your patients to eat them, but for some people that's not practical because they don't have access, they don't have the time to cook. So using a extract would be my preferred route here to get any of these clinical indications in from a compliance perspective. So that's the nervous system conversation. And we know that mushrooms are also adaptogens. So this could work with any of your patients that have stress-related disease, which is probably 80% of the people you're seeing if you're like me in my practice. So looking at things like insomnia problems, they're just not sleeping quite well. They're in a stressed mode. So, their sympathetic system is just a little bit more, or maybe a lot more dominant. And I think that reishi and cordyceps have the most to offer here, as they're more known as the true adaptogens. But I do think that all the mushrooms can play a role here, and I'll show you why in a bit when we talk about even things like shiitake and how that might help the immune system function in the gut level when stress is present. So looking at how mushrooms can basically be your adaptogen that you go to with these patients. And again, reishi I find is really nice, really gentle, but really supportive adaptogen. And it also works well with people that are stressed, that have a lot of anxiety. Cordyceps is another great adaptogen that works well with stress, and they actually have lower energy. So those are kind of the two distinctions, but they're not perfect because obviously there's lots to consider when dosing adaptogens, and are you going to pair them with other lifestyle or herbal things to support their nervous system? So those are the two that I use the most often, but I do believe that some of the other mushrooms have, a lot of potential to help with our stress regulation system. So there's a lot of mushroom myths out there, I call them. So autoimmune diseases, mushrooms are not a absolute contraindication. I would agree that they are sometimes a relative contraindication, and you really need to know your patient. You really need to know what's going on. But mushrooms, there's not a lot of data to suggest that they are harmful in autoimmune conditions. They can impact people and create different changes, I'll call them. Some people call them flares, but sometimes that's just due to an underlying microbiome issue, I find. You will find that the odd person with an autoimmune condition doesn't tolerate a certain type of mushroom. So sometimes it's a good opportunity to use a lower dose of a blended product, which is something that I do a lot of. So I use a lot of, we have a blend at Real Mushrooms called 5 Defenders, and I use that a lot for my autoimmune patients. You do have to be careful. So it is a relative contraindication, but can be very, very effective with some of these cases, as they are immune modulators. So looking back, and my friend Lee Carroll has basically come to the condition that they're almost an immune tonic. So he's a good friend of mine who's really into the mycology space, and he's calling them immune tonics now. And I'd have to definitely agree with Lee in the sense on how the immunology works and how that all goes with different conditions. So same thing with candida and different fungal infections. So you can use mushrooms. I would say reishi and oyster would be the ones that I would try to work with. And sometimes people will say, oh, I have a patient with candida, or I have a client with candida, I can't give them mushrooms. I'd say that's not the case. Even though, mushrooms are in the fungal world, you still have all of these unique immune supporting benefits that are in mushrooms like reishi that actually help reishi, when it's growing, prevent itself from getting basically a fungal infection or a minor fungal infection. So basically these mushrooms, when we're growing them, and we're growing them all outside in a natural environment, the reishi, so they actually have to sort of fight, and they have to fight to grow, to live. So they're creating these compounds that help do that for them. And we're leveraging some of those in our treatment plans. Mushrooms, culinary mushrooms, I believe, can be a little bit higher in histamine than some foods. Mushroom extracts don't have a ton of histamine from the research that I've done. So patients with histamine problems, you're going to want to maybe use an extract over, mushrooms in the diet and see if that helps, if they're really reactive. Leftovers are always a problem with these patients sometimes, especially if they're super reactive. So, mushrooms that are left over would probably be higher in histamine, like any fermented food. And there's a little bit of an interaction with a compound called spermidine in mushrooms. So that can sometimes interact with DAO, which is the compound that extracellularly in the gut degrades histamine. So there is a connection there, but that's not really relevant unless you're eating a ton of them and depleting that enzyme system. And that's still kind of new as well. So how to actually use these things is another question. And this is kind of just like, I tried to pick out some very like foundational things that we could work with as a group and go through like how to actually put this into place. So upper respiratory infections, I think mushrooms are great, especially for kids as well. And the big ones that has the most research is oyster mushrooms, and specifically a beta-D-glucan named pleuran in oyster mushrooms. And you'll find that if you're getting a mushroom extract, you'll find that in the beta-D-glucans are in the mushroom extracts from oyster. So the dose would be 100 milligrams per day from what the research says, or 10 milligrams per kilogram for children. And basically, if you use a oyster mushroom extract that is around 500 milligrams, 125 milligrams of that is going to be the beta-D-glucan that is mentioned here. So you're going to want to get the 1-to-1 because you're going to want to get that insoluble fiber as well. So that just means a 1-to-1 extract. There's varying levels of extract ratios. And this is really important for people that get, recurring respiratory tract infections. So whether that's somebody that's relatively healthy with no medical condition, but they're always getting an upper respiratory tract infection, or people like COPD patients that have recurring infections due to an underlying lung pathology. This is also really good for athletes and overreaching. So that just means overtraining. So athletes are actually prone to immunosuppression based on the amount of exercise they're doing. So that high output can actually dampen the immune system. And there's some studies out there showing that oysters can kind of help, but they can help reduce the frequency of infections due to overtraining. And same thing with these upper respiratory tract infections in relatively healthy people. It can almost decrease the frequency of people getting these recurrent infections by almost 50%, which means they'll have less sick days, they'll be sick for less, and they'll get less side effects from the upper respiratory tract infection, which is usually a virus, which can sometimes lead to things like an ear infection or laryngitis or some sort of lower down respiratory infection. So this is a really good opportunity to use oyster. You could cook with it, you could get an extract. For practicality, extract might be nice to have, and just get something that's hot water extracted or something that you're cooking to basically help break down the hard to digest parts when cooking in the diet. Another place to look for when using mushrooms for the immune system are allergies. So these are particularly things like atopic conditions. So things like asthma or eczema or atopic dermatitis is another a phrase for that. So I usually use reishi, and I find that you have to kind of use it for a decent amount of time for it to work. So you can't just expect to take it like a Claritin or Reactin and for it to work right away. It may have an impact because it's, can be anti-inflammatory. It can help with histamine modulation, but over time with your allergy patients, asthma, eczema, those kind of conditions really work well when using an adaptogen like reishi over time, specifically, before the event, if it's like an environmental allergy, like hay fever. Eczema, there's no real timeline, but some people is worse in the winter. So looking at using mushrooms for this reason, because they are immune modulators, they help bring the immune system back to that Th1 side, usually, that's case dependent, and they help with Treg and different immune cells that can help reduce the impact of allergies, and specifically the allergy symptoms, which is what all the patients are concerned about, the runny nose, the inflammation, the mucus, the itchiness, all that. And reishi has triterpenes in them, which is another compound which basically has histamine modulating research done on it. So you can use the reishi for the immune modulation activities, and then you can use the triterpenes in the reishi because they've been studied to help with histamine modulation. So that's allergies. Another key reason to, or how to use mushrooms in your practice is prevention. So, foundations are always step number one for prevention. So that's lifestyle, sleep, diet, stress management, exercise. And then you have the things you can do, to help prevent that person or yourselves or your family from getting sick. And this involves both the innate and the adaptive immune response. And mushrooms have some pretty good research in this world, specifically around activating things like natural killer cells, macrophages, kind of like some of these first and second responders. And they definitely help boost that Th1, basically immune system that will help your innate immune system right off the bat, help with some sort of early exposure to virus to help the resolution of that. So this is also a good time to talk about the gut again, because we know that the gut can have an impact with the different immune cells that I've been mentioning here, definitely at like a lung level. And this kind of image here shows that the quicker you can basically support your innate and adaptive immune system with a viral infection, the quicker it is to basically get that virus under control. So I do believe mushrooms are a really good supportive agent for an acute stage illness, and definitely like as an adaptogen before that stage even. So looking again at reishi, that's the one I just put here. Like when in doubt, just go with reishi because it's a very good overall tonic, but I swear this presentation isn't all about reishi. You could use other ones here, like I said, like the oyster. You could use a blend like the 5 Defenders blend. It all depends clinically, which I think, in the future, if we want to dive into the more kind of personalities of the mushrooms and how to use them, I think that would be great. And then another good opportunity. Oh, and then I just didn't mention dose, but, you don't need a ton, but you do need like a little bit of that immune tonifying capacity, or the dose has to basically match the patient. So I usually dose about 500 milligrams or half a gram to 1500 milligrams or 1.5 grams. And that is in that kind of like an early stage to help support the immune system. And definitely in like the adaptogen dosing, that's what somebody would be on, even before an illness, to help bolster their immune system, whether that's in cold and flu season. That's usually when I have my mushrooms. Yeah, I'm calling everybody a mushroom these days, because I'm in the mushroom world so much, but my patients, that's usually when I tell my patients to take mushrooms. Oh, I got to take a drink here. Okay, I got to get moving. So chronic infections are another great opportunity to use mushrooms. So these are things like viruses, different co-infections, different chronic infections like Lyme. And again, these are the mushrooms that I use the most for these patients. So for the EBV patients, I will use a combination of reishi and turkey tail. Same for the HSV, same for the HBV. And then Lyme and co-infections, I'm more prone to use cordyceps and a blend when working with those patients. And that's because varying reasons, but there's a lot of clinical research and more clinical experience, I should say, with Lyme and cordyceps and the impact it has at the neuro level. So using cordyceps is also helpful for that. And because a lot of these patients have low energy, and there's a lot of mechanisms of the different compounds in cordyceps that may be able to help. So the dose kind of varies, but anywhere from 1 to 4 grams. When I use cordyceps in some of those late stage co-infection cases, I will use a higher dose. So these are the isolated extracts that you may see in some of the papers if you dive into the mycology world. And these are essentially a drug-like mushroom product is how I describe them. So they're not a pharmaceutical, but the way that they process them is very similar in their accuracy and the way that they create sort of like an isolated compound that can be used as a treatment. So the big ones at the top, PSP, PSK, those ones come from turkey tail, and they're an isolated pure mycelium product. So they're different from myceliated grain, but they do come from a mycelium starting point. And then AHCC comes from a isolated shiitake mycelium. And again, that's 100% pure mycelium with some processing that allows them to have, key immune potential. And there's a few other ones here. That's from reishi, from shiitake, and then from maitake in that order there with the ganopoly, lenten, and D fraction. So those are things that you're not going to have access to other than the AHCC, you can actually get that as a supplement. And that has some good research in the oncology world and also some viral modulation. Okay, so tried to get through quite a bit there. I'm going to just peek at the chat and time. Okay, so I think I got about, 5-10 more minutes. So I'm just going to continue and then we'll do some questions. So looking at turkey tail, so this is, again, with those isolated extracts, the most oncology research has been done on those, PSK and PSP. There's a little bit of data with the mushroom, but it's more in just like a general immune, and there's another breast cancer study with that as well. And essentially, this is a great overall mushroom for looking at general immune modulation. So I use this one in kids a lot because it's very safe, very gentle, very dependable. And then again, it has different modulation capacities with the gut, depending on where you pull the research from and which extract you are looking at. And then again, viruses are a good place to work with this mushroom, specifically some of those viruses mentioned on the 2 slides above. And then, there's different cancers or oncology conditions that have more research. So I've listed a few there, and you're going to want to, definitely dial into the research when trying to use this in that setting for nutritional support, not in a diagnostic or treatment form, but just looking at the research and trying to support patients and clients the best as possible. So tremella is a lesser known mushroom, and you can see here it's very very interesting to look at. It's a very beautiful mushroom, and it's actually been used traditionally to help skin health. So it's good for any kind of dry condition. And using tremella has also been used in Chinese medicine to support yin deficiencies. So those are often conditions that show up as different expressions with symptoms, but usually some dryness, and good for, dry cough, good for dry skin, things like psoriasis, eczema. I use this a lot for. And this one has some different immune compounds than the other mushrooms. So it actually has unique immune supportive agents and skin, and it has a unique constituents compared to other mushrooms, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Here's the cordyceps mushroom. So we're using Cordyceps militaris. Traditionally, they're using a different species called sinensis. And this one has some clinical experience, or I've got clinical experience using this with athletes, different infections, like mentioned earlier, post-pneumonia treatment. I use this one a lot. So if you have patients that are, have a lower respiratory tract infection, I find cordyceps the best mushroom for that, specifically if they're having breathing problems, low energy, and they're not doing so hot. And then it's a very kidney specific mushroom as well, where a lot of the other ones aren't. And it has some research to suggest that it could help with kidney function, with different applications there in the kidney world, whether that's from a traditional or a modern biomedical perspective. And athletes love this one. It basically has these unique compounds in them that are very similar to adenosine, and that helps with our cellular energy. So looking at cordyceps for that reason can be very supportive. And the autoimmune cases, this and reishi are the 2 that I use the most. And depending on, some of those personality things, like I mentioned with the client and how their symptoms are expressing, I'll use those in different contexts. Chaga. Okay. Chaga, not a lot of biomedical clinical trials on this mushroom, but there's a ton of cell studies on it showing it can work on different immune pathways. Traditionally used a lot for gastrointestinal specific conditions like ulcers, different gastritises, or not different, but gastritis. And it's got a lot of redox potential. So you probably notice in my slideshow, I never put antioxidant, but I do put the ability for these things to have a kind of redox regulating capacity. And this mushroom, which isn't even a mushroom, it's in a different category, and used traditionally a lot in the Russian and Siberian cultures and Scandinavian cultures and First Nations cultures and indigenous cultures. And there's some dosing here, just kind of, loosely based on the evidence and also traditional context. Oyster, we touched on a lot, and oyster isn't just good for the respiratory tract infections, but it does have some other actions. But essentially, that's where I would see you using it the most. And it's also very high in ergothioneine, which is that kind of sulfur adaptive antioxidant compound that we mentioned. Lion's mane, this one's very, very popular, and for good reason. So we mentioned that this and tremella would be the ones to consider when looking at any kind of cognitive case you have, whether that's, dementia, Alzheimer's, also looking at other nervous system problems too, like, post-concussion. I know a lot of people use that clinically. There's not a lot of good research on that yet, but I know people are using it for any, basically any illness that impacts the nervous system. So this one has been dosed basically 1.2 to 2 grams per day, and they're usually using a mushroom powder, like I said. So an extract would work really, really good here. And then again, this one is very available at a lot of farmers market these days, so you can absolutely get your patients to eat this if they have access to it, but that's not always the case. So usually a powdered lion's mane product would be where it would kind of help. And the compounds in lion's mane are these unique carcinones and isoindolinones. Those are the big ones that are showing the ability to impact nerve growth. So I'm going to go just a little bit further here, and then I'm going to stop. So maitake is one that has more of a, again, I wouldn't just use this alone in blood sugar regulation cases, but it has most of the data on that compared to other mushrooms. So there's a fertility study showing that it may help PCOS patients when combined with a certain medication. And there is a few studies showing that it may have an impact on fasting blood glucose when used in combination with adjunct therapy. And again, it has, very awesome immune potential and resources and research done on it. So these are, again, using things that are more of an isolated maitake product. And these are some traditional and biomedical doses that are in most of the studies. So it kind of depends on how they're using it, but that's a general overview there of maitake. And then shiitake. So we're almost getting to the end here. So looking at shiitake, it can actually help increase the immunoglobulin IgA in the gut, and it can also reduce inflammation based on biomarker studies with CRP, and it can also help in certain adjunct oncology cases, again, using dose specific isolated fractions usually, and a great one to eat. Everybody's got access to this one by now, I think. So this one is really accessible for all your clients, and it's a really tasty mushroom too. So using mushrooms, practically, I use a lot of the powders. You can see here, the lion's mane powder just comes in a bag, and it's the hot water extract that you can just use in different recipes. So cooking them into, a lot of different types. So you could use them in drinks, you could use them in meals, and I've put a couple examples here. And you can also take these straight up, like in water, if you're, feeling brave or you have brave clients. So diet's usually best to kind of mix these powders in. That's why I like the powders a little bit more than the capsules for this reason. But some people do enjoy capsules, and we have a whole product line that has both. So kind of the person and their preference would be what to match that to. And I'm going to send you all our recipe guide on how to start to use, mushrooms more in the diet with your clients. And that will come, when I send the notes over after the show. Here's just a couple examples of our recipe book, some kind of fancier things, but like there's simple things that people can do like on a daily basis that I think really help. Mushroom side effect chart, I'll leave this in your notes for you, and you can just go over that. There's a lot of theoretical interactions with mushrooms. A lot of them haven't played out clinically, I've seen, but there are things to consider. So I think that's probably a good time to shut it down just a touch and kind of go into the chat here.
This is fantastic. So much great information. And I also just want to give a major shout out to all of you asking the questions, because I literally kept writing questions and looking up, and somebody would write the exact same question. So we're all like on the same page here, which is fantastic. The one, I think you kind of already answered this question, but one of the top questions is, do we get a copy of this presentation? Because I know everybody here would love that.
Yeah, I can do that.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. So some of these things you have, I'm going to kind of skip over the ones that you have talked about, but we've talked about some of the fancier mushrooms here, fancier, but the chaga, the reishi, the even shiitake, and etc. Something like white button mushroom, are we going to get benefits from eating sort of just the straight up run of the mill grocery store mushrooms, or is that sort of I don't bother?
Yeah, sorry. And I didn't include that in this one, but it's absolutely one to include. And it's the most accessible, more than shiitake. So thanks for that. But it's got a lot of good research, a lot of good compounds, beta-D-glucans. And yeah, it's an excellent mushroom to include in clients' plans.
Awesome. What are your thoughts on, we'll just go to the hard question right away. What are your thoughts on Host Defense, the, I guess, competitor brand or a competitor brand?
Yeah. So I won't speak directly to any brands, but what I can say is that myceliated grains, when you look at all the analytical testing in the mycology world, it has significantly less immune active compounds. So why that's important is that if we're leveraging, all the research that is basically done and all the traditional use. So traditionally, they always ate the mushroom.
Right.
And in all of the modern data, they're also using high beta-glucan compounds. So when comparing that to what's available, you're going to want to use 100% organic mushroom extract. Ours are organic, which is a nice benefit, but you're going to want to use organic mushroom extracts to basically piggyback and deduce from that data. So I'm not a huge fan of myceliated grain products just because they don't have a lot of the bioactive compounds compared to the mushroom. And what people think they are getting is a mushroom, but there's actually no mushrooms in those products. So that is, something just from like an informed consent perspective that I think is not in my ethics to, be in that world of, thinking you're getting mushrooms, but there's actually no mushrooms in the product. But it comes down to bioactives, comes down to traditional use was always the mushroom. And also all the biomedical research is something similar to the analytical footprint in a mushroom extract.
Got it. Really helpful. And that's also helpful to not just get into what this brand versus that brand, but giving really good information as more brands come out to be able to sort of decipher what's quality and what's going to have the best clinical results. Cam, question from Martha. Could you go into more details about the methylation support potential?
Yeah. So basically, the B vitamins in mushrooms can just act as a nice support to these different methylation pathways for certain people that have, biological variances in those SNPs. So I can actually include a couple blogs and research notes on that when I send the information over, if that would be helpful. But essentially, you want to get good nutrition to help all those pathways along, and mushrooms have basically B vitamins. They also have ergothioneine, which is great for basically modulating our biology from that redox potential. So I'll send some info along on that.
Awesome. We had several people ask the question in terms of, or this might just be one that I wrote down and saw here. What are the best ways to prepare? Does it matter if it's raw versus cooked, for example? If we're thinking about it from a culinary perspective, are we going to lose any of the sort of medicinal or functional properties if we prepare it in a certain way?
Yeah, so I definitely recommend some sort of heat processing. So all of our products are hot water extracted. So what that does is it breaks down the tough outer wall of the mushroom called chitin. And chitin kind of is a insoluble, undigestible hard kind of outer wall. It's similar to like a crustacean kind of shell. that's the same compound. So you want to use heat and water to break that down. So when you're cooking, I would cook them on, low heat, whether that's with like some water or some oil. And if you're using them in a soup, I wouldn't just put them in like at the end, but I would put them in like, at least 10 to 15 minutes to get that breakdown process going. Because what ends up happening then is that you can break down the chitin, which sort of has the beta glucans within the cell wall, and it makes them more bioavailable. And those are the things that have the most research on them that help us out the most. So yeah, cooking is or diet is absolutely fine. I wouldn't eat them raw. It won't like necessarily kill you. With shiitake, some people do get like a dermatitis if they eat them raw. So you have to be careful there, but I wouldn't recommend eating them raw, but I would cook them with that kind of medium to long heat style.
That's really good. That's great. Maybe that's why they taste so much better when they're cooked too.
Yeah, they do.
Martha asked about the MRT, and Cindy, thank you for responding there that yes, the MRT does have mushrooms. And just for any of you who are wondering, the mushrooms that are tested on the MRT are the white button mushrooms. Suzanne has a great question here about dosing long term. Do you have a recommended duration and pulsing? So for example, do you recommend switching or rest periods after a given number of days or weeks?
Yeah, I think it's always good not to be on anything forever. And I think that helps, bring a little bit of hormesis or adaptation to the body. But generally, I think, have people on them for 4 to 8 weeks, and you can do like 5 days on, 2 days off if you want, or you could go maybe 3 weeks, 1 week off. And that just gives the body a little bit of time off to, do that. But we don't really have any research to suggest that, longer term, a lot of the studies are done from like 12 to 16 weeks. So they're definitely fine to take for that amount of time. And from a, more of like a personal opinion, I do like to take a break, and I do like my patients to take a break from something because I think our body does adapt. It likes variety. So not to push like certain pathways. So I'll do that like 3 weeks on, 1 week off sometimes, or I'll do the 5 days on, 2 days off, just to allow the body to have some reprieve. But if you're using them, for certain immune conditions or for diseases, or, helping patients out, not from a treatment perspective, but just supporting them through nutrition, then you might want to use them long-term every day. And that's more of like a talk with their clinician as well, bringing them in there.
Have you seen any benefits, or has there been any research done into using mushrooms with clients suffering from long COVID?
Yeah, I can't basically think of it right now, but there has been a lot of studies done in the last 2 years, and I don't know if any specifically are long COVID, but there's a lot of immunology studies going on showing how they could be helpful for COVID. I know that. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything published yet, but there's lots of inference there that maybe they could be supportive for different reasons.
Angela's asking about mushrooms as a FODMAP. Is that an absolute contraindication? And would, in that case, supplement mushrooms also be contraindicated?
I think I don't do a ton of the FODMAP with my patients, but I know some people get value from it. But what I will say about this question is, I know that some mushrooms are probably higher on that list. I don't know if they've ranked all of them yet, and they definitely haven't ranked the extracts, but they are a polysaccharide, so they would fit under that heading. But yeah, I think I'd have to get back to you on that one. And I think that when looking at mushrooms, you definitely would want to get a mushroom over a myceliated grain, because there would be more of those like simple sugars that would feed that process going on. But yeah, I'm not an expert. I don't do a lot of the FODMAP stuff, so I can't, fully answer that one. Sorry.
Can you please speak to any mycotoxins in mushrooms? Are they contraindicated for those with mold illness?
So all, mushrooms are a fungus. There's different molds and stuff that we test for. So we go above and beyond for all the microbial and mold testing. So there's no mold in the products. Some of these SIRS and mycotoxin patients and different people that have been exposed to mold, they will be sensitive. And they'll be sensitive to anything from a mushroom to food to water. So some people probably won't do well with them. I think the research is still too new. From a clinical personal opinion, I have patients that have mycotoxin-borne illness and I give them mushrooms, but it's all individualized. So working with that, but some people may react and you just have to either go a different avenue, try a different maybe spectrum supplement or like a blend if you're using one single mushroom and see how they respond there, but you won't really know until you use them. But I would say, they're not an absolute contraindication.
Okay, great. We have several questions, different forms of it, wanting to know how to access the product. Are you on Fullscript? Do you have practitioner accounts? And I do see a request to bring real mushrooms onto our healing solutions, which they are in some. I can't remember what classes that we've integrated it into some classes and not yet in all of the classes, but they're coming. So we'll do that part from an RWS perspective. But how can people get these products and get them to their clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll type in just our website and we have a health practitioner sign up form at the bottom of our website. We will be on Fullscript soon. We're just completing some paperwork. So as soon as that comes, I'll let your team know. And but yeah, we have a practitioner program. We're available in Canada and the United States. I know a lot of you are in the United States and some of you are in New Zealand, Australia. So we are working with a New Zealand provider now with our extracts. So I'll put those in the notes as well.
Right.
And yeah, sign up for a practitioner account for sure, because we have all of our educational resources on there. So even if you're going to order them on Fullscript, please sign up for an account if you're interested, because we have leading mycology experts. We do newsletters. We have monthly meetups, kind of like this, where we go over different mushroom topics. And you'll get that when you go to our website and sign up for the health practitioner account.
That's awesome. I have to say that 5 Defenders is one of my all-time favorite products. I use it with almost all my clients at some point or another. Absolutely love it. Okay, I think that we have answered all. Oh, we have one question here from Laura. I'm sorry, Laura, I almost skipped it. Would taking a beta-glucan supplement have any real benefit?
Is that like a yeast beta-glucan supplement, or can we get a little bit of confirmation with that?
Yeah, Laura, if you want to, you can
type it or
unmute yourself. We're a small group here. Feel free to unmute yourself or just pop it into the chat and let us know what you're thinking of in terms of that kind of what type of beta-glucan supplementation you're thinking of.
Hey, yeah, I especially the last couple of years, I believe it's Douglas Labs has a beta 1,3 glucan that a lot of people were taking. And I feel like people had great benefit, but I wasn't sure if that was just, all in their head, if it was actually helpful.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura, for your question. So yeah, there's a lot of good data and research on yeast-derived beta-glucan. So I think that it has a lot of potential and clinical value. They're just different from the mushroom beta-D-glucans. So yeah, I think that it's a thing that people do and get success with. So I think that yeah, they have their value. Mushroom beta-D-glucans are just a little bit different. All the weights are different. All the structure is really different. So I think they're different, but they're kind of, they have the same compound, the beta-glucan. They're just a little bit different in how they interact with the receptors. And we're still learning a lot of that stuff. But yeah, they can be helpful too, those different beta-glucan supplements.
Okay, thanks for the explanation.
You're
Mason,
welcome.
thank you so much. This has been absolutely invaluable information. I know we've got lots of follow-up resources to come from you, so I will make sure that we get those, and we will be posting this on our YouTube channel and sending it out to all of you. So if you feel like I do, I took lots of notes, and I also feel like I need to go back and watch the whole thing again and take even better notes. So we'll make sure to send that to you all. And Mason, you shared the website. Can people connect with you? Can they follow you on like Instagram or socials, anything like that? How do they stay in touch?
Yeah, I can put that all in the notes and I'll put it here. So that's our Instagram. This is my clinic name. Those are all the Instagram ones. And I'll put my clinic website if anybody's interested. But yeah, those are the big ones. And if you sign up for practitioner account, you can email me directly through there. So you'll have access to, any resources you need. And I'm happy to help with, you guys in your practice. And I appreciate you coming out to this talk. And yeah, I hope to see some of you again, because it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg when going into the mycology world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you, everybody who came, especially those of you here live. It's always so fun to get your questions and the interaction. Thank you so much, Mason. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and a great summer solstice right around the corner. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.